He was 19, a German prisoner in Texas. She was a farmer's daughter with an apple in her hand. The summer of 1944 stretched wide and dry over Gainesville, a small town tucked into the red dust and cornfields of northern Texas. The war was half a world away, but its echoes hummed even here. In the rumble of army trucks, the whisper of ration books, the metallic glint of barbed wire that ran like a scar through the fields. Behind that wire stood men in faded gray uniforms, the remnants of Rommel's Afrika Korps. They were sunburned, thin, and far from home. They worked the land for local farmers, hoeing and harvesting under the same Texas sun that baked their guards in khaki. They were enemies, technically, but mostly, they looked like boys too tired to remember why. The camp itself was nothing more than a grid of barracks and watchtowers surrounded by endless sky. Dust rose with every step, and the smell of sweat and diesel hung in the air. Inside, the prisoners joked in German, smoked cheap tobacco, and counted the days with chalk on their bunks. Some played chess with bottle caps. Others just stared through the fence at the horizon, the direction of home. It felt strange, one of them would later write. We were prisoners, but better fed than we'd been as soldiers. Among them was Karl-Heinz Muller, 19 years old, from Stuttgart. He had been captured in Italy, shipped across the Atlantic in a steel belly of a transport ship, and unloaded into a country he had only known through propaganda posters, the land of jazz, chewing gum, and the enemy. Every morning, the guards lined them up and marched them to the fields. They were given gloves, shovels, and lunch pails, and a sense of absurd calm. War was still raging in Europe, but here, the loudest sound was the rustle of corn. That's where he first saw her. She came down the dirt road on a bicycle, her hair tied back with a ribbon, the sun glinting off the metal basket strapped to the handlebars. Inside were apples, bright red, shining like something out of a dream. She couldn't have been much older than him. Carl stopped what he was doing and just watched. She saw him too, the young man in the field behind the fence, sleeves rolled up, dirt on his hands, his face sharper from hunger than from age. For a moment, their eyes met. He expected her to turn away, maybe even spit. That's what he'd been told Americans would do. Instead, she smiled. Without a word, she reached into the basket, took one of the apples, and tossed it gently toward the fence. It hit the wire, bounced once, and rolled until it stopped at his boot. He froze. The guards were only a few yards away. One of them called out, "Keep moving." Carl looked down at the apple, then back at her. She nodded, just a small motion. "Go on, take it." He bent down, picked it up, and turned it over in his hand as if it were gold. "It was the first thing anyone had given me since the day I was captured," he would write years later. And it wasn't food. It was a sign that maybe the world still had people in it. The girl hesitated, then got back on her bicycle. She rode away, her dress fluttering in the hot wind, the basket lighter by one apple. Carl stood there until the dust settled behind her wheels. That night, in the barracks, he placed the apple on his bunk. The others laughed. "Look at that, Carl's got himself a sweetheart," one of them teased. He didn't answer. He just turned the apple slowly in his hand, memorizing the curve, the weight, the small dent where it had hit the wire. The next morning, he ate it, not out of hunger, but ceremony. The sweetness hit his tongue like a forgotten memory. For the first time in months, he smiled. The guards noticed him looking toward the road after that. They warned him once, "Stay away from that fence, boy." He nodded, but his eyes still searched the horizon every morning. And then, one day, she came back. It was late afternoon, the air thick with the smell of corn and sweat. The men were packing up their tools when they saw her bike again, the same red apples glinting in the basket. She stopped at the same spot, a few meters from the fence, and leaned the bike against her leg. This time, she didn't throw anything. She just looked at him. He smiled, a real smile, and touched his cap in greeting. She waved, quick and shy. Then she turned and pedaled away once more, her laughter faint under the hum of the insects. That night, Carl couldn't sleep. He didn't know her name. He didn't speak her language. But he had felt something impossible, that in the middle of captivity, he had been seen. In his small notebook, between German words and numbers, he wrote one line in shaky English. "Girl with apple, smile like home." The next morning, when the whistle blew and the men lined up for roll call, he found himself standing taller. Even the guards noticed. One of them muttered, "Guess the Kraut's in love." Maybe he was. Or maybe, after 2 years of being treated like a weapon, he was just remembering what it felt like to be human. She didn't come every day, but often enough that he began to believe she might return. Each time she did, it was the same. A glance, a wave, a brief moment of connection through wire and sunlight. It was nothing. And yet, it was everything. He never told her his name. She never told him hers. Still, in the dust and heat of that Texas summer, a strange peace took root. Two young people, divided by war, sharing a silence that said more than words ever could. She left as quietly as she came. The guards pretended not to notice. The other prisoners pretended not to care. But Carl kept standing by the fence, just in case. And when the sun dipped low behind the hills, he thought he saw her shadow in the distance. And something inside him stirred that had been dead since Africa. They said he was lucky to survive the desert, lucky to survive capture. But that summer in Texas, Carl Muller learned there are softer kinds of survival too. She never said a word to him. Not one. But when she pedaled away that first day, he already knew. She'd be back. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. They didn't speak the same language, but they kept talking. She came in the late afternoons now, when the heat slid off the fields and the sky turned copper. Always the same bicycle with the crooked handlebar, the same basket that clinked faintly with jars or apples, or sometimes nothing at all. She would stop short of the warning sign, one foot on the dirt road, one on the pedal, and wait until he looked up from the rows of corn. He always did. The fence hummed between them. It was 4 strands of wire and a strip of no man's land, but it might as well have been an ocean. Still, it carried something invisible, a rhythm, a question, a kind of language they built from glances and gestures. One day she brought him a stub of pencil and a scrap torn from a feed sack. She tossed it underhand, slow, as if afraid the air itself might protest. He caught it near his boot, raised his eyes, and nodded once. The next day, he handed her something back, a drawing of a tree, rough lines in graphite, and next to it, a girl on a bicycle. She laughed softly, a sound carried through the wire like a secret. He couldn't understand her words, but he could read her face. And that was enough. Inside the camp, the story spread. Carl's got himself a sweetheart, one of the prisoners said, grinning. The guards pretended not to hear. Someone smuggled him a better piece of burlap. Another gave him a carpenter's pencil stolen from the work shed. The barracks became a small conspiracy of quiet kindness. He started sketching more. Her hair, the bicycle wheel, the shadow of her smile. She began leaving small notes folded in her basket. The words meant nothing to him, but he kept every scrap, smoothing them flat with the palm of his hand, reading their shapes as if they were maps. Sometimes, when the guards turned away, she'd hum, just a few bars of something light, probably from the radio in town. He answered with a line of melody he barely remembered from home, a German lullaby. They didn't know they were singing the same tune about the moon. In the evenings, the fields glowed. The prisoners trudged back to the barracks, dust on their boots, sweat streaking their faces. Through it all, he'd turn once more toward the road, searching the horizon for a flash of white. Her dress, her ribbon, her bicycle glinting like a promise in the last of the light. He didn't know her name. He called her Apfelmädchen in his head, the Apple Girl. She was a reminder of a world where people smiled without needing permission. The fence became a strange kind of chapel. Even the guards sensed it. One of them, an older man named Price, stopped once and said, "Stay clear of that wire, son. That's not your world." Carl didn't answer. He just stepped back a little. But the next day, he was there again. She brought him a photograph once, the courthouse in Gainesville, a fountain, children playing near the steps. He couldn't read the caption, but he traced the edges of the water, the shadows of trees. On the back, she'd written 2 words, "For you." In return, he drew a cat, a window, a pair of hands almost touching. Every night he worked by the dim light of a single bulb, shading carefully so the lines wouldn't smudge. The others in the barracks watched him and said nothing. They knew that the drawings kept him alive. When the rains came in September, the field turned to mud. She came only when the sky cleared, standing at the fence with her shoes sinking into the wet earth. Her notes were sometimes damp, the pencil fading, but she kept writing them. He dried each one under his blanket, saving them all. And then one morning, the whistle blew for roll call, and his bunk was empty. His clothes were gone, folded neatly. His cap lay on the pillow, the band stiff with the scraps of her letters hidden inside. The guard read a list. Transfers to Oklahoma. By the time the truck started, the others understood. He'd been moved. No warning, no goodbye. That afternoon, she came as usual. Bicycle, ribbon, dust on her shoes. She waited near the same post, shading her eyes from the sun. The men in the field looked away. No one spoke. No one told her. When the guards shouted for the workers to line up, she didn't move. She stood there for what felt like hours, her hand resting on the handlebars, her basket still full. Finally, she reached down, took a peach from it, the first fruit of the season, and rolled it under the fence. It stopped in the dirt, untouched. She looked up, but there was no one there. A friend of Carl's, a man named Dieter, found the peach later and wrapped it carefully in a scrap of paper. On it, he wrote the only English he knew. He remembered the apple. The next morning, he wedged the paper into the wire where she stood. When she came again, she found it fluttering in the wind. She read it once, then pressed it to her chest. After that, she stopped coming. The fence went quiet. The guard stopped glancing toward the road. The air felt heavier. The laughter in the barracks dimmed. War was ending. Everyone could feel it. Ships were crossing the Atlantic, cities falling, radios full of words like victory and liberation. But for one girl and one boy separated by a strip of wire and a map's width of ocean, the war had already ended and left silence behind. Years later, in an archive box from Camp Gainesville, someone found a piece of burlap wrapped around a pencil stub. On it, drawn in faded graphite, was the face of a girl smiling beside a bicycle. At the bottom, in tiny English letters, the artist had signed it. Carl H. Muller, Texas, 1944. The bell rang at dawn, and his bunk was empty. January 1945 crept into Texas with a thin frost, enough to make the barack roofs shine pale before melting away. The men woke to the sound of boots on wooden floors, belts tightening, and tin cups clattering against bed frames. The guard slid open the door, voice flat as paper. Roll call. But when he reached Carl Muller on the list, he paused. The bed was made perfectly, the blanket smoothed. A cap rested on the pillow, folded neatly, the way soldiers say goodbye without a word. The guard frowned, checked his clipboard again, then read from a second sheet marked with purple stamps. Transfer, Fort Reno, Oklahoma, 0600 hours. That was all. No one spoke. Dieter, Carl's bunkmate, picked up the cap and felt something stiff inside the lining. Folded scraps of paper, hidden there for months. He set it back gently, afraid that even touching it might erase what it meant. Outside, engines coughed in the cold. Trucks waited in a thin mist, their canvas sides flapping. The prisoners chosen for transfer stood in a line, heads bowed against the wind. No one asked where they were going. No one ever did. The guards waved them forward, the engines groaned, and the convoy disappeared down the road, the dust hanging in the air long after the sound was gone. That afternoon, when the fields turned gold and the shadows stretched long, she came. The same bicycle, the same ribbon in her hair, the same hopeful tilt of her head. In her basket, a peach, though the season hadn't yet turned. She stopped near the warning sign, just short of the fence. Waited. No one came to meet her. Dieter saw her from the field. He wanted to tell her, but what words could he use? He barely knew 10 in English, none that fit what had happened. So he kept working, head down, until the guard looked away. Then he approached the fence, eyes low. She understood anyway. Slowly, she took the peach and rolled it under the wire. It stopped in the dirt, untouched. She waited one more moment, her face unreadable, then climbed on the bicycle and rode away. That night, Dieter took a stub of pencil and a scrap from a ration box and wrote in crooked English. He remembered the apple. He pushed it into the wire where she always stood. When she came the next morning, the note was fluttering in the wind. She read it once, pressed it to her chest, and rode home in silence. After that, the fence went quiet. Inside the camp, days blurred into one another. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. The guards laughed easier. The radio spoke of rivers crossed and cities liberated. In the mess hall, someone found a harmonica, and for the first time in months, music drifted over the wire. But for Carl's friends, and for the girl by the road, the world had already gone still. She kept a small notebook now, hidden under her pillow. On one page she wrote, Strange how you can miss someone you've never met. Another day, I waited again. Foolish. Then, dreamed of a fence that became a bridge. By spring, rumors filled the air like pollen. Germany collapsing, Hitler dead, peace coming. The guards seemed lighter, even polite. When victory came in May, the siren that usually marked work hours blared 3 long notes, and then silence. Men stared at each other, unsure whether to cheer or cry. The barbed wire came down that week. They rolled it like an old carpet, hammered out the fence posts, and burned the watchtowers for firewood. The sign "No approach" fell face first into the mud. The war was over. She came once more to where the fence had been. The ground still carried its mark, 2 parallel scars through the grass. She set another peach there, this one perfectly ripe, and whispered, "Goodbye." The guard watching her didn't move. When she turned to leave, he said softly, "It's done now, miss." She nodded, but inside, she wasn't sure what done meant anymore. Across the ocean, Carl worked the fields of Oklahoma under a bigger sky than he'd ever seen. Wheat stretched forever. The wind was red with dust, the sun harsh and flat. At night, the men listened to the radio. American swing music, thin and crackling, but still alive. He didn't understand the words, but sometimes, when a soft saxophone played, he saw her face again. The ribbon, the bicycle, the apple. In August, they told him he could go home. He thought of writing a letter, but where would he send it? What address did you use for a memory? He left the camp with one drawing tucked into his pack, the portrait he'd made of her the summer before, the edges worn thin. Back in Texas, the field grew quiet again. The girl, older now, but not by much, married a man from the next county. The notebook went into a drawer beside ration coupons and old photos. Life went on, slow and practical, the way it always does after a war. Decades passed like weather. The old camp became a warehouse, then a feed store. The road was paved, the fields divided. People forgot there had ever been prisoners there at all. Only a few names lingered in the county archives. Then, one autumn morning, when the mailbox creaked and the air smelled faintly of rain, she found an envelope. It was postmarked Stuttgart, Federal Republic of Germany. The handwriting was careful, each letter shaped as if afraid of being wrong. Inside was a photograph, an old piece of burlap, yellowed by time. On it, drawn in faded graphite, was a girl standing beside a bicycle, smiling towards something just out of frame. Beneath it, in uneven English, "Do you remember the apple?" Her hands trembled. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence. Outside, the same Texas wind moved through the grass where the fence once stood. She sat at the table for a long time, staring at the picture. And when she finally looked up, it seemed, for just a moment, as if she could hear the faint, impossible sound of a pencil scratching on burlap again. It began with 6 words. "Do you still remember the apple?" The envelope looked ordinary, white, thin, the kind that usually held bills or advertisements. The return address was in another language, the postmark faint but legible, Hamburg, West Germany, 1985. The handwriting was neat, careful, the letters formed slowly by someone who'd learned English from a dictionary, not a teacher. Linda almost tossed it aside with the junk mail. She'd just come home from school, tired, chalk dust still on her sleeves. The house was quiet, the air humming with the late Texas summer. Then she saw her maiden name, Mrs. Linda Cooper, née Harris. Her heart stumbled. No one had written that name in 20 years. At the kitchen table, under the yellow light, she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of thin paper. The ink was blue, the words deliberate, as if each had been weighed before it was written. "Dear Mrs. Harris, my name is Karl-Heinz Muller. I hope you will forgive this letter from a stranger. I was one of the German prisoners held near Gainesville, Texas, in 1944. I was 19. You were the girl with the bicycle and the apple." Her breath caught. The air around her thickened until even the clock ticking on the wall felt too loud. "I never forgot the girl with the apple." The letter went on. He had found her name through the Red Cross, tracing records through the archives of the U.S. Army and old POW registers. He wrote of coming home to a city in ruins, of working as a bricklayer, then as a draftsman, finally a painter. He wrote of his wife, a kind woman with eyes like winter sky, and of losing her to illness, of raising 2 sons, of how, through all those years, The memory of a girl's small kindness had followed him like a soft echo he could never shake. I have painted many things, landscapes, faces, still lives, but never one moment meant as much as a fence, the sun, and an apple rolling through dust. She had to stop reading. Her fingers trembled against the paper. He ended simply, "If you are still in Texas, I will come next spring. I wish to see that place again, perhaps even to thank you in person." No sentimentality, no pleading, just a quiet, unwavering promise. When her husband John came home from work, he found her sitting there, the letter lying open beside a half-drunk glass of sweet tea. "You all right, Lynn?" he asked. She handed it to him wordlessly. He read it in silence, his brow furrowing at the careful handwriting, the foreign rhythm of the sentences. When he finished, he looked at her, not angry, not jealous, just surprised by the weight of it all. "Well," he said softly, "I'll be damned." They sat for a while without speaking. Then she whispered, "He was just a boy." John nodded. "And you were just a girl." His voice was gentle. Guess the world wasn't ready for that kind of thing back then. Later that night, after dinner, she read the letter again under the lamplight. The paper seemed warmer now, almost alive. She could picture him, the quiet boy behind the wire, eyes pale and tired, holding the apple like it was something holy. Her husband touched her shoulder. "It's strange," he said. "It's not jealousy I feel. It's respect, maybe, for what something that small can mean to a person." Outside, the wind stirred the trees. The house was still, but she could almost hear the faint rattle of the old fence in her mind, the same sound it made that summer afternoon in 1944. At midnight, she sat down and began to write back. Her hand shook as she wrote the first line. "Dear Mr. Muller, yes, I remember. I remember the fence, the sun, and how quiet the world was when you smiled. I never thought you'd remember me, but I'm glad you did. You should come." She paused, staring at the signature. For a long time, her pen hovered. Then, softly, she wrote, "Yours, Linda." The next morning, she drove to the post office early, before school. The clerk stamped it twice, par avion, the blue ink bleeding into the envelope like a pulse. Afterward, life returned to its rhythm. The hum of lessons, the laughter of children, the scrape of chairs on linoleum. But at odd moments, while folding laundry or waiting for the coffee to brew, she'd think about him. About a 19-year-old boy in a torn uniform, smiling at an apple through barbed wire. She told no one but John. Yet something about her changed, a brightness, a stillness. Her students noticed. "You look happy, Mrs. Cooper," one girl said. Linda just smiled. "Maybe I remembered something important," she answered. Winter came, mild and short. Christmas lights went up across the town. The letter stayed in her dresser drawer, folded neatly between photographs of her parents and a dried wildflower from her wedding bouquet. Then, one January afternoon, another envelope arrived. Same handwriting, same faint blue ink. Inside was a single line. "I have my ticket. I will come to America next spring." She sat by the window, the letter trembling in her hand. Outside, the apple tree in her yard stood bare against the fading sun. The branches, thin and crooked, reached toward the sky like they were waiting too. For the first time in 40 years, she felt 19 again, and the world, impossibly, felt open once more. 41 years later, two strangers looked at each other, and both began to cry. The arrival gate at Dallas, Fort Worth buzzed with the usual shuffle of voices, rolling suitcases, and airport announcements echoing overhead. But for Linda, the noise faded into a kind of blur, as if time itself had softened around her. She stood just beyond the yellow barrier, clutching a single red apple in both hands. It gleamed in the fluorescent light, absurdly bright, like something from another lifetime. Her heart thudded in her chest. She hadn't slept the night before. She had ironed her dress twice, brushed her hair 3 times. Her husband, John, had offered to come with her, but she'd said no. "This isn't a reunion," she told him. "It's history closing a circle." The flight from Frankfurt landed 30 minutes late. Passengers began to trickle out, tired faces, tourist hats, children clinging to stuffed animals. Then she saw him, a tall man, silver-haired, moving slowly, one hand gripping a worn leather bag, the other holding a bouquet of small white flowers. His eyes scanned the crowd with the nervousness of someone arriving in a country he once only saw through fences. When their eyes met, both froze. Neither moved for several seconds. Then, Hesitantly, Linda stepped forward. He stared at the apple in her hands, and something inside him broke loose. A smile first, small and uncertain. Then laughter, wet with tears. "You remembered," he said, his accent still thick, though his voice steadier than she'd imagined. "And you came," she answered, and suddenly, the years vanished. They stood there awkwardly, like old friends meeting in a dream, unsure whether to hug or bow. Finally, he reached out, gently taking the apple from her hand. He held it, as if it were made of glass. 41 years, he whispered, and still red. Outside, the Texas air hit him like a furnace. He squinted toward the horizon, wide, empty, endless. "It smells the same," he said. "Dust, sun, and something sweet. Maybe freedom." They drove in silence for most of the trip north. Linda's car hummed along the highway. Carl watched the fields pass by, the same fields he had worked as a prisoner, now green and open. He asked quiet questions. "Do the trains still run there? Is the camp still standing?" Each time, she answered softly, "No trains. No camp. Just land now." When they turned onto the dirt road where it had all begun, the world seemed to pause. The gate was gone, the guard towers erased by time. A few concrete foundations lay buried in tall grass. Cows grazed lazily where barbed wire once split the earth. The sun hung low, golden and familiar. Carl got out first. He stood for a long moment, hands on his knees, breathing deeply. His shoes sank slightly into the dust. Linda stayed by the car, watching him walk toward where the fence used to run. He stopped, looked down, then knelt. The wind rustled through dry weeds. "This is where I stood," he said. "Every day, right here." Linda joined him. Together they traced the line of the old fence, an invisible border only they could still see. He reached into his jacket and took out a folded map, brittle with age. "I drew this when I went home," he said. "Not for the army, for myself. To remember where I learned what kindness was." They walked farther, finding a small slab of cracked concrete half buried in soil. Rusted bolts jutted out, the last bones of the guard post. Carl brushed off the dirt with his sleeve. "We used to count the shadows here," he said. "Morning meant life. Night meant waiting." Linda placed the apple gently on the concrete. "The wind still sounds the same," she murmured. He nodded, eyes glistening. "Yes, the same wind. Only no wire to stop it now." For a while, they said nothing. Only the low hiss of grass filled the space between them. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quiet but certain. "You didn't just feed me that day," he said. "You gave me back my name." She turned to look at him, puzzled. "In the war," he continued, "you stop being a person. You become numbers, orders, hunger. But when someone looks at you, really looks, you remember you were human once. You did that for me." Her eyes stung. "All I did was throw an apple. And that," he said, "was enough." They stayed there until the sky turned copper, the shadows long and soft. When they finally walked back to the car, Carl stopped once more and looked back at the field. "Strange," he said, "how a place can hold both shame and grace." As they drove back to town, the radio played a country song about coming home. Carl didn't understand the lyrics, but he smiled anyway. "It's a happy song," he said. "It is," Linda replied, "though it doesn't sound like it." He laughed, eyes still fixed on the horizon. Before they parted that night, he handed her a small package, a worn envelope tied with string. "Something I should have given you long ago," he said. She didn't open it. Not yet. When she watched him disappear through the hotel doors, she realized her hands were trembling again, the same way they had 41 years before, standing by that fence. But this time, there was no guard, no fear. Just the quiet knowledge that something once lost had found its way back. And yet, as she drove home under the wide Texas moon, she couldn't shake one thought. He hadn't told her everything. Not yet. The apple wasn't just kindness, it was survival. That evening, they sat by the window of a quiet cafe near the old railroad station. Outside, freight trains rolled by every hour, their rumble like a heartbeat under the floor. Inside, everything smelled of coffee and wood polish. The lights were warm and dim, soft enough to hide the years in their faces. Carl placed a small, weathered envelope on the table between them. "I kept this for 40 years, he said. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly, the way old soldiers' hands often do when memory comes too close. Linda looked at the envelope, the paper yellowed and thin. What is it? He smiled faintly. Proof. She hesitated, then untied the string. Inside was a folded sheet of rough paper, browned at the edges. When she opened it, she gasped. It was a drawing. Her face, sketched in pencil, delicate and sure. She was younger there, her hair loose, the hint of a smile just beginning. Beneath it, written in faint German script, Das Mädchen mit dem Apfel. The girl with the apple. I drew it in the camp, Carl said. On burlap. Later I copied it on paper after the war. I wanted to remember that moment, when someone treated me like a person again. The air between them grew still. The sound of the train faded, replaced by the whisper of rain against the glass. You drew? She asked softly. I did. I started that day. We had scraps of charcoal, sometimes pencil stubs. I drew my friends, the guards, the sky above the wire. Anything that reminded me I could still create instead of destroy. He took a deep breath, eyes glistening. After the war, when I returned home, everything was gone. My parents, my house, my country. I thought I would never belong anywhere again. But I still had that picture. It reminded me of light. He leaned back, folding his hands as if to contain the tremor that had returned. I studied art in Hamburg. I painted people. Always people. Not generals or heroes. Faces of those who survived. Women carrying buckets. Children on the rubble. I kept drawing you too. Not from longing, but from gratitude. Linda traced the pencil lines gently, her fingertip following the faint shadow of her own cheek. You carried this all those years? Yes. He smiled again, softer now. When I married, I showed it to my wife. She understood. She said, that girl saved something inside you. She was right. They sat in silence, both watching the rain trickle down the window. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low and slow, the kind that never quite turns into a storm. I never thought it meant anything, Linda said finally. It was just an apple. Carl shook his head. In war, nothing is just anything. Food was rationed. Kindness was forbidden. You could have walked away. Instead, you crossed a line, even if it was only in your heart. That apple said, you still exist. He paused, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. And I believed you. Her throat tightened. She wanted to speak, but no words came. He reached across the table and touched her wrist, light as a breath. You don't have to say anything, he said. You already did 40 years ago. For a long moment, neither moved. The cafe was nearly empty now, the waitress stacking chairs in the corner. Outside, the last train for the night roared past, its horn echoing through the quiet town. Linda finally found her voice. Do you ever hate us? She asked. Americans, I mean. Carl looked at her, surprised. Then he shook his head slowly. No, I hated the idea of war. The people were never my enemy. Hunger was. Fear was. I saw boys from Kansas and Bremen die for flags they barely understood. You start to realize, war isn't between nations. It's between what's human and what's not. He looked down at the portrait again. You were what's human. A tear slipped down her cheek. She tried to laugh it off, but it came out as a sob. All I did was throw an apple, she whispered again. He smiled through his own tears. And that was enough. They left the cafe when the rain stopped. The streets were slick, shining under the streetlights. Carl walked her to her car, carrying the drawing wrapped carefully in his coat. Before saying goodbye, he looked up at the Texas sky, wide and endless. When I go home, he said quietly, I think I'll plant an apple tree. Linda smiled. You should. He nodded. Maybe one day, when it grows, I'll send you a piece of it. She didn't know what to say, so she simply hugged him. His coat smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Thank you, she murmured. No, he said, pulling back. Thank you for seeing me before I was someone worth seeing. They parted there, under the pale orange glow of a street lamp. He turned and walked toward the station, his figure small against the long line of tracks. She watched until he disappeared into the dark, the rain beginning again, soft and steady. When she got home, she placed the drawing on her nightstand, next to the old apple tree visible through her window. The wind moved its branches gently, scattering droplets of rain like silver dust. She thought about the letter, about the train, about the boy behind the wire who had become an artist. She thought she would see him again. But a year later, another letter arrived, written in the same careful blue ink. Only this time, it wasn't from Carl. He was gone, but he left something growing in her yard. The letter arrived in early spring, the paper thin and formal, the handwriting unfamiliar. The return address read simply, M. Muller, Hamburg, West Germany. Linda felt the old tension rise in her chest before she even opened it. She carried it to the kitchen, sat down, and unfolded the page. Dear Mrs. Cooper, my name is Marta Muller. I am Carl's wife. He spoke of you often. I hope this letter does not bring pain. Carl passed away peacefully last month. In his final days, he talked about Texas, the fence, and the apple. He asked that something of his be sent to you. You will find it enclosed, a small tree from our garden. He said it would grow strong, like forgiveness. The words blurred as she read them. For a moment, she could only hear the ticking of the kitchen clock, the low hum of the refrigerator. Then she looked out the window, to the field behind her house, and saw the morning sun just beginning to rise. The package arrived 2 weeks later. A small wooden crate stamped live plant, handle with care. Inside, wrapped in damp paper and straw, was a fragile sapling no taller than her arm. Its roots smelled faintly of rain and soil. She touched one leaf, trembling. That weekend, she carried the sapling to the edge of the old field, the same land where the camp had stood. There was nothing left now except open sky and wheat, but in her mind, she could still see the outline of the fence, the shape of a boy standing on the other side. She dug a small hole with her hands. The dirt was warm, soft. For you, she whispered, and lowered the roots into the earth. As she covered them, a gust of wind swept across the field, bending the young branches gently toward her, as if bowing. Years passed. The sapling grew. Every spring it flowered white and clean, the kind of blossoms that caught the morning light and made the whole yard glow. People in town began to notice it. Some said it was the prettiest apple tree in Cook County. A journalist from the Gainesville Times came one day, after hearing about the German's tree. He found Linda sitting on her porch with a cup of tea. She told him the story, carefully, simply, without embellishment. He listened in silence, then asked if he could check the archives. A week later, the article appeared, The Apple Through the Fence, a true story of Camp House. It included a faded photograph of Carl's POW record, the official note that ended his file. Returned to Germany, May 1946. Excellent behavior. Neighbors stopped by to see the tree. Some brought flowers, others just stood in the shade, unsure what to say. Linda never made speeches. When asked why she'd kept it alive all those years, she would smile and say, "Because he asked me to." One afternoon, many years later, her grandchildren played under its branches. The grass was thick, the apples ripe enough to fall with a soft thud. She sat nearby, watching them chase each other in the sunlight, their laughter carried on the wind. She thought of Carl's letter, the first one, the last one, all the words between. She thought of that summer in 1944, the fence, the heat, and the weight of a single apple rolling through dust. The wind moved through the branches, scattering petals across the ground like snow. She closed her eyes and listened. For a moment, it sounded almost like voices, laughter from far away, or maybe the echo of something that never really ended. When she opened her eyes, her grandson had picked up an apple and held it out to her. "Here, Grandma," he said. She smiled and took it. The skin was warm from the sun. "Did you know," she told him quietly, "that wars don't really end when the guns stop?" He looked at her, puzzled. "When do they end?" She turned the apple in her hand, its surface shining in the light. "When someone decides to be kind anyway." He nodded, though he didn't fully understand. But one day, she thought, he would. And as the afternoon faded and the wind rustled through the leaves, the apple tree, Carl's tree, stood tall and silent, roots deep in Texas soil, branches reaching toward the open sky. Because sometimes, to change the world, all it takes is a single hand reaching through the wire.